Usually in filmmaking, we as filmmakers, we try to add some separation between the talent and the background so that there is just some distinction. You can focus on the talent more and the talent pops a little bit more from the background. A really easy way of doing this is filming in a large location. Larger locations make it really easy to separate that talent from the background physically, but that's not always the case, and you've probably run into it, or if you haven't yet, you probably will in the future. You're going to be left with a very small location. Think of like a cubicle or a small bedroom, an office space, a studio space, or a kitchen or something like that, where that physical space just makes it really challenging to create that separation from the background. And although challenging, there are some things you can do to still really make that talent pop and still create some separation from that background. Now, the first thing is finding your frame, and this really applies to any shot. It doesn't matter the location. You want to find your framing first before you start flying in a bunch of other equipment. However, it is especially important to do this when you are working with a small location, particularly when you don't have the opportunity for a location scout. I see this quite a bit where it's a small location, you haven't had a location scout, and it's like all hands on deck. Let's just get all the gear inside. Let's get this room lit. Let's go ahead and go for it. And maybe you walk in real quick and say, okay, I want the camera to point that way, and I want the key light coming from this side. And everyone's like, cool, let's go ahead and do it, and start setting up equipment, thinking, hey, this is going to be efficient if everybody is kind of doing their part all at the same time. The problem with that is when that's happening, the room gets exponentially smaller and smaller the more gear that you bring in. And if you haven't dialed in exactly the frame that you want, it's going to be very, very difficult to move that tripod around and finesse the camera position when all these light stands and C-stands and all this stuff is in your way. Number one, physically, it's just harder to move things. And number two, you're much more likely to bump a C-stand or a mic boom or something like that if all that's set up while you're still trying to find your frame. So that's why I just say find your frame first before you bring in any other equipment, so that you know exactly where your camera is going to be. And then once you do that, once you get your tripod height and all that stuff all set up, just tape off where your tripod is going to be. Then you can move that out of the way if you need to bring in your equipment. And the next thing you can do is film into the corner of the room. Now, this kind of relates to the first tip, but filming towards the corner of the room, it's going to maximize your depth in the scene. Many times what I'll do is I'll put the camera in the far corner as far as I can tuck it away in the corner and move that talent where I need them to be to create some nice separation. Typically that will land them in the middle of the room, and that'll give you some nice separation from the background. And as a bonus, a lot of times that corner of the room will give you some nice leading lines that will kind of focus your attention to the talent. But sometimes filming into the corner just isn't an option. Sometimes your talent just has to be right up against the wall, and that's where using hard light can really come into play. I like doing this a lot. Like, I like to throw hard light against that back wall to create some texture. And what that does is that little breakup pattern is just enough to create some separation and some texture from the talent from the background. And to me, it just adds some visual interest and can even sometimes act as a motivation for a key light if you don't have a source in there already for motivation. So that's super helpful. But for me, I really like doing this. It just kind of adds like fake depth sometimes. And what you can also do is you can like put different items. We'll talk about this here a little bit later, but put some items in the frame that kind of get in the way of that hard light to kind of cast dramatic shadows and stuff if you don't have something like a spotlight or a Leco mount where you can throw patterns in there. So that's another option with using hard light, is to kind of create patterns or texture on that back wall. One thing I started doing a couple years ago in small spaces is starting to set up lights from the background to the foreground. Now, it seems kind of counterintuitive. You usually want to set up the key light first, so that looks good. But if you kind of know the general area where the key light is going to be, I find it a lot easier to set up your light stands and everything in the background first and kind of move your way to the foreground. Simply from a practicality standpoint, it's just easier to navigate to the back of the room when there aren't so many stands and stuff in your way. So you get all those set up, and then once your key light and everything's set up, you can go back and make small tweaks to those different C-stands or light stands or whatever the case may be. But it's a lot easier to make those tweaks after those lights have been set up, as opposed to navigating around a bunch of stands and stuff to fully set up a light and all that, if that makes sense. Now, I touched on this earlier when talking about hard light, and that has to do with set design. Be really intentional. Like if you're in a small space, like you gotta be really intentional about set design. You don't want it to have it looking too cluttered and busy, unless like that helps tell the story. But also, like, you don't want it to be so bare that it feels just like empty. So what I mean by that is like adding different things in the frame that can help even frame your shot out, or help like in this shot right here, this kind of help do two things. It help with the framing, but also help cast some nice shadows on the back wall to add some texture. While there may not be a lot of physical depth in the image, you're still able to kind of make the scene and the frame look interesting. So that's all I have for you in this one. I'm gonna wrap this up because this dude's mowing his lawn next door, so probably can't hear me anyways anymore. So let me know if this is helpful, and leave a comment down below. Let me know like what your trick is to filming a really small location. So appreciate you watching, and hope to see you in the next one. Peace.